And we're now starting Section 5, Illustrations of the General Law of Capitalist Accumulation. And this section has 6 subsections. The first is England from 1846 to 1866, then the badly paid strata of the British industrial class, then the nomad population, then the effect of crises on the best paid part of the working class, then the British agricultural proletariat, and finally Ireland. A. England from 1846 to 1866. No period of modern society is so favorable for the study of capitalist accumulation as the period of the last 20 years. It is as if this period had found Fortunatus's purse. But of all countries, England again furnishes the classical example, because it holds the foremost place in the world market, because capitalist production is here alone completely developed, and lastly, because the introduction of the free trade millennium since 1846 has cut off the last retreat of vulgar economy. The titanic advance of production, the latter half of the 20 years period again far surpassing the former, has been already pointed out sufficiently in Part 4. Although the absolute increase of the English population in the last half-century was very great, the relative increase or rate of growth fell constantly, as the following table borrowed from the census shows. Annual increase percent of the population of England and Wales in decimal numbers, 1811 to 21, 1.533%. 1821 to 1831, 1.446%. 1831 to 1841, 1.326%. 1841 to 1851, 1.26%. And 1851 to 1861, 1.141%. Comment, so something like 0.1% slowing in that rate for every decade. Continuing. Let us now, on the other hand, consider the increase of wealth. Here, the movement of profit, rent of land, etc., that come under the income tax furnishes the surest basis. The increase of profits liable to income tax, farmers and some other categories not included, in Great Britain from 1853 to 1864 amounted to 50.47%, or 4.58% as the annual average, according to the 10th report of the Commissioners of H.M. Inland Revenue, London 1866, that of the population during the same period to about 12%. The augmentation of the rent of land subject to taxation, including houses, railways, mines, fisheries, etc., amounted for 1853 to 1864 to 38%, or 3 5/12% annually. Under this head, the following categories show the greatest increase. So there's a chart showing houses, quarries, mines, ironworks, fisheries, gasworks, and railways, and the excess of annual income of 1864 over that of 1853 being respectively 38.6%, 84.76%, 68.85%, 39.92%, 57.37%, 126.02%, 83.29%, and the increase per year being respectively 3.5%, 7.7%, 6.26%, 3.63%, 5.21%, 11.45%, and 7.57%. If we compare the years from 1853 to 1864 in 3 sets of 4 consecutive years each, the rate of augmentation of the income increases constantly. It is, for example, for that arising from profits between 1853 to 1857, 1.73% yearly, 1857 to 61, 2.74%, and for 1861 to 64, 9.3% yearly. The sum of the incomes of the United Kingdom that come under the income tax was, in 1856, £307,068,898, in 1859, £328,127,416, in 1862, £351,745,241, in 1863, £359,142,897, in 1864, £362,462,279, in 1865, £385,530,020. Footnote, these figures are sufficient for comparison, but taken absolutely are false, since perhaps £100 million of income are annually not declared. The complaints of the Inland Revenue Commissioners of systematic fraud, especially on the part of the commercial and industrial classes, are repeated in each of their reports. So, for example, quote, a joint stock company returns £6,000 as assessable profits. The surveyor raises the amount to £88,000, and upon that sum, duty is ultimately paid. Another company, which returns £190,000, is finally compelled to admit that the true return should be £250,000. Unquote, back to the main text. The accumulation of capital was attended at the same time by its concentration and centralization. Although no official statistics of agriculture existed for England, they did for Ireland, they were voluntarily given in 10 counties. These statistics gave the result that from 1851 to 61, the number of farms of less than 100 acres had fallen from 31,583 to 26,597. So that 5,016 had been thrown together into larger farms. That's according to the census. And footnote, John Bright's assertion that 150 landlords own half of England and 12, half of the Scotch soil, have never been refuted. Back to the main text. From 1815 to 1825, no personal estate of more than £1 million came under the succession duty. From 1825 to 1855, however, 8 did. And 4 from 1856 to June 1859, i.e. in 4.5 years. The centralization will, however, be best seen from a short analysis of the income tax Schedule D, profits exclusive of farms, etc., in the years 1864 and 1865. I note beforehand that incomes from this source pay income tax on everything over £60. These incomes liable to taxation in England, Wales, and Scotland amounted in 1864 to £95,844,222, in 1865 to £105,435,579. Footnote, these are the net incomes after certain legally authorized abatements. Main text, the number of persons taxed were, in 1864, 308,416 out of a population of 23,891,009. In 1865, 332,431 out of a population of 24,127,003. The following table shows the distribution of these incomes in the 2 years. I'll put this chart on the screen. I'm not going to read out all the fields. In 1855, there were produced in the United Kingdom 61,453,079 tons of coal, of a value of 16,133,167 pounds. In 1864, 92,787,873 tons, of a value of 23,197,968 pounds. In 1855, 3.2 million tons of pig iron, of a value just over 8 million pounds. In 1864, 4.8 million tons, of a value of almost 12 million pounds. In 1854, the length of the railroads worked in the United Kingdom was 8,054 miles, with a paid-up capital of £286,068,794. In 1864, the length was 12,789 miles, with capital paid up of £425,719,613. In 1854, the total sum of the exports and imports of the United Kingdom was £268,210,145. In 1865, nearly £490 million. The following table shows the movement of the exports. And there's a footnote for the figure from 1866. At this moment, March 1867, the Indian and Chinese market is again overstocked by the consignments of the British cotton manufacturers. In 1866, a reduction in wages of 5% took place amongst the cotton operatives. In 1867, as a consequence of a similar operation, there was a strike of 20,000 men at Preston. And Engels adds in the 4th German edition, that was the prelude to the crisis which broke out immediately afterwards. Back to the main text. After these few examples, one understands the cry of triumph of the Registrar General of the British people. Quote, rapidly as the population has increased, it has not kept pace with the progress of industry and wealth. Unquote. Let us turn now to the direct agents of this industry, or the producers of this wealth, to the working class. Quote, it is one of the most melancholy features in the social state of this country, says Gladstone, that while there was a decrease in the consuming powers of the people, and while there was an increase in the privations and distress of the laboring class and operatives, there was at the same time a constant accumulation of wealth in the upper classes, and a constant increase of capital. Unquote. And a footnote that's from Gladstone in the House of Commons, February 13, 1843, as quoted in the Times. The Hansard version is as follows. It is one of the most melancholy features in the social state of this country that we see, beyond the possibility of denial, that while there is at this moment a decrease in the consuming powers of the people, an increase of the pressure of privations and distress, there is at the same time a constant accumulation of wealth in the upper classes, an increase of the luxuriousness of their habits and of their means of enjoyment." Unquote. Back to the main text. Thus spake this unctuous minister in the House of Commons of February 13th, 1843. On April 16th, 1863, 20 years later, in the speech in which he introduced his budget, quote, "From 1842 to 1852, the taxable income of the country increased by 6%. In the 8 years from 1853 to 61, it had increased from the basis taken in 1853 by 20%. The fact is so astonishing as to be almost incredible. This intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, entirely confined to classes of property, must be of indirect benefit to the laboring population," not where I thought he was going with that, "because it cheapens the commodities of general consumption. While the rich have been growing richer, the poor have been growing less poor. At any rate, whether the extremes of poverty are less, I do not presume to say." Unquote. How lame an anticlimax. If the working class has remained, quote, "poor," only less poor in proportion as it produces for the wealthy class, quote, "an intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power, then it has remained relatively just as poor. If the extremes of poverty have not lessened, they have increased, because the extremes of wealth have. As to the cheapening of the means of subsistence, the official statistics, for example, the accounts of the London Orphan Asylum, show an increase in price of 20% for the average of the 3 years, 1860 to 1862, compared with 1851 to 1853. In the following 3 years, 1863 to 65, there was a progressive rise in the price of meat, butter, milk, sugar, salt, coals, and a number of other necessary means of subsistence. Footnote, see the official accounts in the Blue Book, Miscellaneous Statistics of the United Kingdom, Part 6, London, 1866. Instead of the statistics of orphan asylums, etc., the declamations of the ministerial journals in recommending dowries for the royal children might also serve. The greater dearness of the means of subsistence is never forgotten there. Back to the main text. Gladstone's next budget speech of April 7, 1864, is a Pindaric dithyrambics on the advance of surplus value-making and the happiness of the people, quote, tempered by poverty. He speaks of masses, quote, on the border of pauperism, of branches of trade in which, quote, wages have not increased, and finally sums up the happiness of the working class in the words, quote, human life is but, in 9 cases out of 10, a struggle for existence. Footnote, the Hansard version runs, again, and yet more at large, what is human life, but, in the majority of cases, a struggle for existence, unquote. The continual crying contradictions in Gladstone's budget speeches of 1863 and 1864 were characterized by an English writer by the following quotation from Boileau. Such is the man. He goes from black to white. He condemns in the morning what he felt in the evening. A nuisance to everyone else and an inconvenience to himself, he changes his way of thinking as easily as he changes his way of dressing. Back to the main text. Professor Fawcett, not bound like Gladstone by official considerations, declares roundly, quote, I do not of course deny that money wages have been augmented by this increase of capital in the last 10 years. But this apparent advantage is to a great extent lost because many of the necessaries of life are becoming dearer. Marx adds, he believes because of the fall in value of the precious metals. Quote, the rich grow rapidly richer, whilst there is no perceptible advance in the comfort enjoyed by the industrial classes. They, the laborers, become almost the slaves of the tradesmen to whom they owe money. Unquote. And a footnote, as to the increasing dependence of laborers on the retail shopkeepers, this is the consequence of the frequent oscillations and interruptions of their employment. Back to the main text. In the chapters on the working day and machinery, the reader has seen under what circumstances the British working class created a, quote, intoxicating augmentation of wealth and power for the propertied classes. There we were chiefly concerned with the social functioning of the laborer. But for a full elucidation of the law of accumulation, their condition outside the workshop must also be looked at, their condition as to food and dwelling. The limits of this book compel us to concern ourselves chiefly with the worst paid part of the industrial proletariat and with the agricultural laborers, who together form the majority of the working class. But first, one word on official pauperism, or on that part of the working class which has forfeited its condition of existence, the sale of labor power, and vegetates upon public alms. The official list of paupers numbered in England, and this includes Wales, 851,369 persons. In 1856, 877,767. In 1865, 971,433. In consequence of the cotton famine, it grew in the years 1863 and 4 to 1,079,382 and 1,014,978. The crisis of 1866, which fell most heavily on London, created in this center of the world market, more populous than the Kingdom of Scotland, an increase of pauperism for the year 1866 of 19.5% compared with 1865. And of 24.4% compared with 1864, and a still greater increase for the first months of 1867 as compared with 1866. From the analysis of the statistics of pauperism, 2 points are to be taken. On the one hand, the fluctuation up and down of the number of paupers reflects the periodic changes of the industrial cycle. On the other, the official statistics become more and more misleading as to the actual extent of pauperism in proportion, as with the accumulation of capital, the class struggle, and therefore the class consciousness of the workers develop. For example, the barbarity in the treatment of the paupers at which the English press, like the Times, the Pall Mall Gazette, etc., have cried out so loudly during the last 2 years is of ancient date. Engels showed in 1844 exactly the same horrors, exactly the same transient canting outcries of, quote, sensational literature. But frightful increase of, quote, deaths by starvation in London during the last 10 years proves beyond doubt the growing horror in which the working people hold the slavery of the workhouse, that place of punishment for misery. Footnote, a peculiar light is thrown on the advance made since the time of Adam Smith, by the fact that by him the word workhouse is still occasionally used as synonymous with manufactory. For example, the opening of his chapter on the division of labor, quote, those employed in every different branch of the work can often be collected into the same workhouse, unquote.